All right. We're a couple of minutes after the hour. I think we should go ahead and get started. So I'm going to reintroduce myself. I'm Dwayne Spencer. I'm the president and CEO of Habitat for Humanity of Greater Memphis, and welcome to our own Memphis Habitat You, Racism and Housing Policy in America. So first, I want to explain why this chat, as well as the series we're launching with it called +U. It actually comes from the name of a campaign that Habitat for Humanity International launched shortly after the pandemic began, called Homes, Communities, Hope +U. That campaign name, I'm sure, was pulled from our mission statement, which is seeking to put God's love into action. Habitat for Humanity brings people together to build homes, communities, and hope. And we can only do that together with all of you, especially at a time more than ever when we all know the importance of a decent place to live. As part of Habitat International's +U conversation series, I was fortunate to be a part of back in June. I had the opportunity to moderate a conversation with Richard Rothstein, the author of The Color of Law. And that conversation was eye-opening, especially for a lot of the members of our local staff and board. They shared with me that they didn't really know the true history of housing segregation in America and all of the enduring effects on people of color. So I invited my friend Natosha Reid Rice to host a conversation with our team here in Memphis, staff and the board, specifically about racism and housing, so that we could just dig a little deeper. And I have to say that conversation was riveting. It was uncomfortable at times, and it was absolutely necessary. So we wanted to bring a similar conversation to all of you. This started off as something we were going to do with a local emphasis to many of our local friends and supporters to help them really understand the dynamics of racism on housing. But I'm happy to say that there are also many other friends from around the country who are watching. So welcome to all of you. You know, this topic is certainly not germane only to Memphis. So I'm happy to see all of you here. So without further ado, and for those of you who don't know her, I'd like to introduce Natosha Reid Rice, who currently serves as the Associate General Counsel for Real Estate and Finance at Habitat for Humanity International. In this position, she initiates and manages financing programs and strategies to generate unique sources of capital that enable Habitat affiliates to provide decent, affordable housing to families throughout the US. In addition to her work at Habitat, Natasha is the founder of Fresh Rain for Life Ministries and is the Minister for Public Life at All Saints Episcopal Church. She's passionate about providing a voice to the voiceless, that's really important right now, and opportunities to communities that have been historically disadvantaged. Natasha is a highly regarded keynote speaker and workshop facilitator for organizations such as Delta Airlines, the Junior League of Atlanta, the Atlanta Hawks, Lead Atlanta, churches and other civic and community organizations on topics such as the power of authentic leadership, the intersection of faith and justice, the power and impact of privilege, equity and inclusion, race and gender justice, and community empowerment. Natasha received her JD from Harvard Law School and her BA in government with honors from Harvard Radcliffe College. And today, Natasha will share some perspectives with all of us on racism and its impact on housing in America. Natasha, thank you.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you so much, Dwayne. Thank you for that introduction. And more importantly, thank you for the invitation to join with you, the many folks in Memphis, and I see several from around the country who are joining us today for what I think is obviously a very important conversation. And my hope is that this conversation will continue to encourage, inspire, but not only that, to also provide some lessons learned and importantly, provide a context for the great work that many of you are already doing and engaging in on a day-to-day basis. So the first question that I ask coming to this type of conversation is, why is this conversation even important, right? We are ushered into it in many respects in various ways, through our work, through our personal lives, through the news cycle, through what we've just experienced collectively as a nation, watching the murder of George Floyd and hearing of the murder of Breonna Taylor and Rayshard Brooks and Ahmaud Arbery. And those are just those folks that have been named, that have really brought to the forefront in this time where we cannot tune into sports the way we typically have, or we cannot get distracted by multiple social gatherings and multiple meetings because of this pandemic. We are now truly collectively brought into this conversation. Much of what I'll talk about today in terms of the history of housing, the impact of that history on our communities and on our ability to neighbor with each other is not new information. I think that's important, and I think Dwayne alluded to that. But I do think we are tuning into it in a new way. And I believe that right now we are a part of the change of will in this country. So that's my transparent opinion, and that is also my hope. So why is this important? Why is this conversation important? I first begin just with a broad context of understanding. As we all know, this country was built on the narrative that included words like freedom and equality, access to land, property ownership, being the land of the free, the land of the brave, right? All of these wonderful high ideals, as stated in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, and it does say men, are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So the question becomes, are we in this moment providing and setting people up to pursue this happiness? Are we in a country that is dedicated to liberty? Are we living in such a way that we are providing opportunities for liberty to all of the citizens in this country and the people who call it home? I think our answers are obvious, right? We're still in a country where we've not lived up to these ideals. As the Kerner Commission pointed out in their report in 1968, America is two societies, one Black and one white, separate and unequal. I think a similar statement could be made today, and of course it wouldn't be limited just to one Black and one white, but it could possibly be divided between the haves and the have-nots. And in many instances, the haves tend to be predominantly white, and the have-nots tend to be predominantly people of color, with a very high percentage composed of African Americans. In a recent article in the Washington Post entitled, "The Black-White Economic Divide is as Wide as It Was in 1968," the authors of that article have gone forth to say that in 2016, and this is now talking about the why, the typical middle-class Black household had approximately $13,000 in wealth versus $150,000 for the median white household, an even larger gap in terms of percentage than in 1968. Everybody knows that people of color are at an incredible economic disadvantage, but few realize that it's as bad or worse than it was before the civil rights movement. That's why we need to continue to have this conversation. And having this conversation about race and its intersection with housing is such a powerful way for us to understand the impact of racism and creating a systemic injustice and unjust environment that in many instances has only been amplified by this pandemic. During the course of the pandemic, many of our cities, many of our localities are under stay-at-home orders. Well, that takes on a very different meaning when you don't have a home, when you don't have a decent, affordable place to hunker down and to stay safe and to protect your family. So this conversation of housing and its intersection with racial equity is so essential to understanding how to rebuild our country, not only brick by brick, but neighbor by neighbor and soul by soul. When we look at the history of housing in this country, We realized that for decades, federal, state, and local housing policies denied Black households equal access to home ownership. They steered bank investment away from Black neighborhoods and excluded them from thriving communities where quality schools and other resources help kids do better later in life. Starting in the 1930s, the Federal Housing Administration began insuring private loans that would ultimately help millions of white families obtain affordable, low down payment mortgages and join the middle class. The federal and state government participated in creating a subsidy for white families in order to build a middle class. Many of us are involved in conversations about the missing middle. I often wonder in those conversations, are we looking at the historical ways in which our country has subsidized the middle class time and time again? The issue with that is that it's often subsidized the white middle class, but not a middle class composed of people of color. And that's an important component to look at, because that Kerner Commission report in 1968, that we have two societies, that we have a divided America, yet and still we call ourselves these United States of America. It is my hope that in having these honest, courageous conversations, that we all intentionally commit again to create a United States of America in our own cities, in our own localities. And we can do so when we realize the context of housing, of a racial disparity in the housing sector, and find practical ways that we can advocate and shift to change policy. So in 1930s, we, as I just discussed, we heard how the Federal Housing Administration began to subsidize a middle class, but divided our country along racial lines. We see that continuing in the 1950s with the GI Bill. When white veterans came back from World War II, they were offered another housing subsidy that provided no down payment, low interest mortgages in appreciating communities. Think about that impact over generations. That means that generational wealth began to develop and evolve in these white families, while at the same time, Black vets and GIs were denied those opportunities and had to oftentimes live in subpar housing in communities and places where that housing, either they couldn't own the house, or if they did, it was in depreciating communities with a depreciating asset. So white homeowners were able to refi their home multiple times to provide for the necessary expenses related to education, healthy food, healthcare, access to healthcare, and even provide a safety net in the event that there was a major life event that caused them to either have to stop working or pay extreme medical bills. That safety net continued to guide and gird those families through tumultuous times and economic situations, even within our own country. But at the same time, Black households did not have that same cushion. And so we end up with the wealth gap that we're experiencing in many places. In our own city of Atlanta, here where I live and where some of you on the call reside, Atlanta has been ranked by the Brookings Institution as the city with the highest income inequality of any city in this country. We have the haves, we have the have-nots, and there's a great gulf between them. And oftentimes, when you look at the data, you can attribute that gulf, not just in the income inequality conversation, primarily in the wealth conversation, you can attribute that gulf to the lack of home ownership opportunities. Race-based exclusion from the Federal Housing Administration that insured mortgages and subsidized suburbs has contributed to such a gulf and such a division within this country that it doesn't only impact the conversation of housing, it begins to cascade into educational opportunities. It begins to cascade into the very fiber of the conversation about how we begin to look at one another as human beings, how we begin to consider someone a neighbor or someone an other. This translates even into how we treat people in the criminal justice system, which is why Matthew Desmond, the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning book Evicted, goes on to say, when you combine the inequities in the housing system and the inequities in the criminal justice system, that Black women, due to the large number and percentage of eviction records, are oftentimes, as a result, locked out of home and housing and rental and ownership opportunities. And Black men, as a result of the disparities within the criminal justice system, are locked up. That's a profound statement, and it impacts the very communities we're a part of, and it intersects with the very work that many of us are committed to doing. Even after the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, racially restrictive covenants were officially prohibited, but exclusionary zoning by income replaced exclusionary zoning by race. Many people thought that the Fair Housing Act, which is now 50 plus years old, was an end-all be-all solution. But in reality, when we look at it, it is not enforced in a way that it actually has made great change for many who have been excluded from home ownership opportunities. It actually puts the burden on the victim. In the Obama administration, with the passage of the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Act, there was an attempt from the federal level to try to integrate more of our communities around the country. Many of you who are participating in the housing market, in the housing industry, know how difficult even that has become to try to implement, and now that has been put on hold. So really, it is up to us to begin to acknowledge the context in which we are working, the context in which we are living, and now try to understand and excavate at a personal level and a professional level how we can operate in this moment, how we can courageously face this issue of racial inequity in our country, how we ourselves can take up agency and be a part of the change. So I've given you a broad context with some broad data points about how housing and racial inequities have intersected in the past. I now want to turn to each of us on this call, on this conversation today, and look at what it means, because we've begun to hear all these terms: racist, subconscious bias, implicit bias, becoming an ally. Before we jump into the pool of a lot of those new terms, I want us to begin to do our own excavation in this space. To do so, I'd like us to take a look at a chart, which we've called many different names, but in this case, it'll just be a racism spectrum. And you don't have to say out loud or share where you feel like your toe might be stepped on when we look at this together. But I do want to encourage you to think introspectively as we go through this chart. So Kim, if you could put that up for me, that'd be great. Let's walk through this together, and we'll spend just a little time with it, but it's a wonderful way to begin to excavate and to look at yourself in the mirror in the conversation of race and to determine where you may or may not fall. So if you could, look with me beginning on the left side under overt racism. And many of you on this call would never admit to falling into this category, and I would probably agree with many of you. But let's see, what does overt racism usually sound like and look like? So a person who falls in this category would oftentimes say, well, whites are the superior race. You know, I don't know what all this complaining is about. This country was founded for the superior race, right? Or the efforts that we're making are because we're the one pure race. Does that ring a bell? Does that sound familiar to some of the horrible things that have been done worldwide with that kind of mantra? Under this category would also be whites are under attack. And if we don't act now, we will be minorities soon. Overt racism is driven by fear of losing, fear of missing out, fear that what overt racists have done to other people will then be exacted upon them. So moving along this scale, also this is important, overt racism oftentimes, and not always, but we've seen it throughout the history of our country, adds on an element of theology, quote unquote, by saying this is God's will. And so it's oftentimes linked to some culture and value setting component that tries to continue to undermine all of these other ideals that I brought up in the beginning of our conversation today of equality and liberty. It qualifies them. So many people, as I said, would not identify in this category. Let's move along the scale to subconscious racism. This is when you begin to start dealing with this concept of racism. Oftentimes you say, I'm not a racist, but, right? But black on black crime is really the problem. It's not, since the civil rights movement, blacks have ample opportunity. They're not enslaved anymore. I mean, it's kind of that like ahistorical, non-contextual understanding of race. Well, I mean, they're thugs anyways, right? This is the subconscious racism, is where you don't necessarily call someone, by a negative name because of their race, but you also still process the person who's of a different race as an other. And you blame them for the victimization of their people because of their race, right? So you begin to rationalize your own racist thoughts. This is the one that says, well, I mean, it's like they would look at the horrible George Floyd thing and say, before you talk about how horrible that murder was, you say, well, what did he do to cause that? What did George Floyd say or do to cause that situation, right? This is where you begin to try to undermine the conversation about equity. Then you move down the scale to justification. Again, it's a continued rationalization of your racism. And it's an opportunity to try to protect yourself and not feel the guilt and the shame that is associated with the realization that, I've been somewhat complicit in a system that has not been fair. If if George Floyd had just not resisted, that's what happens in the justification context. Or I just don't like the ghetto. Or, I mean, slavery ended 200 years ago. Really? Why are we still talking about race? It does not acknowledge the fact that there is a system in place that continues to perpetuate inequities for people of color. After justification comes denial. And denial is the place where racism no longer exists. Do we really need to keep talking about race? I mean, come on. We have integrated communities. I mean, really, we had a Black president. Right? This is the category where the folks that were identifying as post-racial. Well, finally, we have a Black president. There's no more racism. It is all taken care of and all solved. Or this is the I don't see color. To translate what the I don't see color is for some folks, because some folks really think that that's a good place to be. The I don't see color says to a person of color, I can tolerate you because I don't actually see your color. Rather than with your color, I accept and love you. It's a totally different conversation. I don't see color because I can say I'm colorblind, meaning I don't see all of you. I can deal with you, right? This is also the defensive place where how am I privileged if I'm poor? The conversation about privilege, and as it relates to white privilege, it's not a matter of whether or not you were born with a silver spoon in your mouth. It is throughout your life, you may have had it tough. You may have had challenges. You have had to work your tail off to get where you are, but you have never been denied an opportunity because of the color of your skin. That's how you begin to talk about white privilege as it pertains to this conversation. So you move from the denial into the white savior context. And it's in this place, that borderline. I have Black friends. That moves me into white savior. I know Black people. I mean, I like Black people, especially when I can help them, right? It's if they want our help, they should be nicer and more respectful. This is that white savior, paternalistic, the place where, I mean, come on, pull yourself up by your bootstraps place without realizing that in 1950, perhaps your dad was given some bootstraps through the GI Bill, right? But now you're 2 generations down the line and you're saying, well, I mean, I think that just like I've worked my way up, you could work your way up without taking into consideration all of the assistance and safety net and protection you had. So it's important in the white savior context to understand that, and as we'd say in the Christian faith, but by the grace of God, go us all, right? Here in the white savior context, you get this as well. I will help you, but only if I lead. This is the place where you get a lot of well-meaning folks who are drawn to philanthropic efforts or charity efforts who want to help people of color, but they don't ever consider those people of color their equal. They don't ever, there then becomes a power play. And they oftentimes say, you know, I'm helping the least of these. And what I often like to say in this conversation is, it's so interesting when you think you're the one doing the helping, and sometimes thinking that the person you're helping is the least of these. Perhaps you're the least of these. Perhaps it's something within yourself that needs to be strengthened and cleansed. Perhaps you need to stop being blinded by your pride, right? And this opportunity will help to open your eyes to that. I mean, it's always a matter of perspective, and also a matter of what is your judgment based off of, right? Is it based off of misinformation? Because in the white savior context is really buttressed by the textbooks that we learned from in elementary school and middle school. Those textbooks told an incomplete history of our people as a country. Notice in those textbooks, all the people that discovered places were white. All of the heroes were white. All of the business owners were white. All right. And so you begin to have this ingrained that white is good and black is bad. And any variation of black into some form of color is less than white. So a white savior feels justified in that positioning because of what they've been taught. So we move down the spectrum from white saviorism. And it's great that you want to help. It's great that you want to lead some efforts, but let's make sure we understand that we're partnering with the people that we're working with, because why? We're all in this together. Woke justification is the next. If we can't use the N word, then they shouldn't either, because now we're all kind of on the same plane. There is no need for people of color to have their own spaces because we're all one. There is only one race, the human race. And so the woke justification really begins to take on what I call an equality conversation. The danger with an equality conversation, and I know you're thinking, equality is always good, right? Equality is wonderful, but equality without equity is short-sighted. So yes, we're all one human race, but let's understand that the race that we're running, we're all starting at different positions because, for instance, with the history of the GI Bill, some of you were put 50 yards ahead of the starting line, while others of us are starting at the starting line. So we're running the same race, but we have different starting points. So yes, when the gun goes off and we run, equality says we're all running the same race, but equity says, but it's not truly from the same place. And since we're not starting at the same place, the person who's 50 yards ahead clearly has an advantage to the one who starts at the starting line. So it's important for us to understand with woke justification, we've got to not only be woke, we have not only have to have a justifying rationale, we've got to make sure that we combine equality with equity in that conversation. And with that, we move into the awareness category. So in awareness, my experience as a white person is now you're starting to realize drastically different than that of a person of color. This is where you begin to realize, you know what? I'm going to stop fighting it. I'm going to stop trying to rationalize around it. Yes, my white skin has given me privilege. It has given me entry. I can go to the store and shop without anyone following me. I can walk down the street and be assumed legitimate just because of the color of my skin. Under the awareness category, you'd say, yes, my life as a poor white person has been hard, but it isn't as hard as if I were poor and a person of color. As a white person, and I've had this conversation with many of my white friends. Yes, I have white friends. Many of my white friends who are also mothers, you know, my sons are in their teenage years. And so when we were talking about our sons or our daughters getting their driver's license, there was great excitement in their households. There was great fear in mine because I was thinking with my Black sons, when he starts driving, oh my gosh, what is he going to encounter? Like when my son started driving, I wanted to go everywhere he was going. He was like, I'm just going around this corner to Publix. And I'm like, yes, but I probably should ride with you. He's like, really, Mom? But that's the fear, because when they get pulled over, sometimes in the Black community, oftentimes we call it the Black bar mitzvah, being pulled over by the cops when you're 16 and 17 and having to get out of the car and put your hands on the top of the car. I mean, the fact that that would happen, that's happened to my godson just last year. The fact that that happens to us on a regular basis is very scary, right? So awareness begins to say, I'm now seeing, and I think a lot of folks are in this category now because all eyes have been on the George Floyd story and the protests in the streets. We're hearing stories that we never heard before. And then we move into the allyship. Systemic racism is very real and needs to be ended. And that's where I hope many of us are today. Some move even further into the accomplice categories. I'm going to begin to make space for people of color, whether it's through housing policy, whether it's in the boardroom, where all of a sudden you're looking around the table and you're realizing every senior leader in here is white. Now you're starting to pay attention. Oh my gosh, the board of my organization has no diversity. Now we're starting to open our eyes and we begin to say something has to change. And in that change, I'm not becoming less than, I'm actually becoming better. Our organizations are becoming better because they're becoming more diverse. We've now begun to identify hidden figures within our own midst that, like the movie, The Story of Katharine Graham, can get us into space, can help us to open up communities in our own localities, our states and our cities, can enrich our conversations and help us to truly see. Because before we had blinders on, limited our ability, limited our reach, limited our donor base, limited our volunteer base, and essentially limited the ability to accomplish the mission and the goals of our organizations. Finally, in the accomplice side, I will put my safety, health, and freedom on the line to fight for people of color. I will let them lead and not try to be at the center. There's a difference between an ally and an accomplice. And that's a very big part of it, is that finding ways, I call it becoming an echo chamber in some situations. You know, that adage that talks about, you know, this happens a lot in gender dynamics. A woman sitting around a table, a meeting table, a boardroom table, comes up with a great idea, no one hears her. And the guy sitting next to her says the same thing. And people are like, oh my gosh, that's such a great idea, right? We need to become an echo chamber for the folks of people of color, the women, the folks that have been rendered invisible because of their sexual orientation, because of where they come from, because of the color of their skin, and say, you know what? I think Jane had a great idea. I think Takia had a great idea. Let's hear more about that. Let's consider some things that we have not yet considered. Let's hear some voices that we ignored. Let's now see some people that we rendered invisible. This conversation, it does intersect with housing. It also intersects with education. It intersects with wealth and income inequality. It intersects with our very understanding of who we are as a people, as a community, and as neighbors. I often say that when we have these conversations, it's important for us to acknowledge the way we fall on this spectrum. A little more about privilege. Sometimes we're still trying to understand privilege, trying to excavate our own privilege and our own complicity, right? I mean, in this country, privilege is not just limited to race, right? Clearly, we're in a Christian country. Those who hold up their hands and identify as Christian, they have a certain privilege that people of other faith traditions do not have. Those who have been educated, they have a certain privilege that those of other educational attainment levels may not have, right? So privilege can be varied. In this conversation about race, when I talk about white privilege, it's important to acknowledge it, because even when we talk about this new vocabulary, some of which I hinted at earlier, subconscious bias, implicit bias, microaggressions, new words for a lot of folks, even the term ally, all of that is laced with privilege. Why? Who owns your bias when it's implicit or subconscious? You don't own it. It just happens. It's just subconscious. It's implicit. It's right. So it's right back there somewhere. I don't really own it. When you talk about a microaggression, anyone who's been the victim of a microaggression, that aggression doesn't feel micro. It's aggression. So even the words that have been used to correct the privileged are euphemistic, which means they're positive sounding, which means they're not truly chastising. That's how you know you're privileged, when even the words that are put in place to correct you are not even as harsh as the impact of those things you're doing, right? When we talk about allyship, we're not going to do a whole session on it, but I want to throw this out. Who is the focus on when we say the term ally? It's on the ally, not the victimized. Think about that when you continue to push these conversations on allyship. And think about when you say you're an ally, you're still putting the burden on the victim to make the corrective change. You're just saying, I'm going to help you. When in actuality, the ally typically is who? If you just throw in the chat, who are we usually referring to when we say ally? I would love to hear it. Just very quickly. Who do you all typically think of when I say an ally? White people, right? White people, white person, the person who has privilege. So wouldn't it make more sense for the people that have been victimized to help the folks with the privilege dismantle the system? I think sometimes we think about it in the wrong order, because the burden should be on the privileged, those who are benefiting from the system, to then begin to dismantle it, rather than the burden being on the victim, who's still trying to climb up the ladder to try to see clearly over the horizon. Just some things to think about when we think about how we position this conversation on race and equity and privilege, and we start to take in the conversation on what it means to be anti-racist and what it means to really leverage our privilege for others to be a part of our community and our conversation. To give you a practical and an application-oriented way to think about privilege, a way to digest a lot of the information that I've covered with you all today, I wanted to show you a video. Let's take a look at it now, and then we'll close out and go to some questions. It will be on shortly. Here we go.
My sister-in-law, who's half black, half white, but looks white, blue eyes, whiter than most white folks, very white. She and I, we kind of grew up together. We raised our children together. So they're first cousins, and it's a wonderful, very, very multicultural family. So we're going in a Safeway one day. And Kathleen, my sister-in-law, is in front of me. And she's, writing a check for her groceries. Now, my daughter, who at the time was 10 years old, was standing with me, and I was directly behind her, getting ready to get my groceries. So Kathleen comes up, and the checker, who is a strawberry blonde, freckled, very delightful, warm, the checker, this young woman, is talking to Kathleen. Hey, how you doing? Isn't it a nice day today? They're just chatting up, and says, yeah. So Kathy writes her check, and she steps off to the side with her groceries because she's waiting for me. Of course, again, Kathleen looks white, right? So I come up. No conversation. She looks up at me. Absolutely no, just a little chatter. And I write my check. My daughter, however, is 10, notices immediately the difference in how she responds to me. So I write my check, and she goes, I'm going to need 2 pieces of ID. At which point, my daughter looks at me, and she gets very, very embarrassed, and tears are kind of coming up in her eye, like, Mommy, you're not gonna let her do this. Why is she doing this to us, right? So I'm trying to figure out what I should do, because behind me are 2 elderly white women, right? And I'm thinking, okay, so then I become the angry black woman, right? And they're gonna be, and I'm just trying to second guess all the drama. So then I just give her the 2 pieces of ID. I said, some things you gotta choose your battles, right? And then it gets worse. She pulls out the bad check book, right? So this is the book that shows the people who've written bad checks. So she starts searching for my license in the bad checks, at which point it's just out of control now. Just as I'm standing there trying to decide what to do, and it's really deeply humiliating. Now my daughter is in full-blown emotionally upset, who's 10. My sister-in-law walks back over. And she steps in and she says, excuse me, why are you doing this? And the checker goes, well, what do you mean? She goes, why are you taking her through all of these changes? Why are you doing that? She goes, well, this is our policy. She goes, no, it's not your policy because you didn't do that with me. Oh, well, I know you've been, she goes, no, she's been here for years. I've only lived here for 3 months. And so at this point, the 2 white elderly ladies go, oh, I can't believe what this checker has done with this woman. It is totally unacceptable. At which point the manager walks over. So the manager walks over and says, is there a problem here? And then my sister-in-law again responds. She goes, yes, there is a problem here. Here is what happened. So you see, she used her white privilege. And even though Kathleen is half black and half white, she recognizes what that means. And she made the statement. She pointed out the injustice. And she, as a result of that one act, influenced everyone in that space. But what would have happened? I can't know for certain had the black woman said, this is unfair. Why are you doing this to me? Would it have had the same impact? But Kathleen knew that she walked through the world differently than I did. And she used her white privilege to educate and make right a situation that was wrong. That's what you can do every single day.
That's one of my favorite examples of how to leverage your privilege, because we can see how that can be applied to so many different situations. She said she used her privilege. And when you look back at that example, what's so great about it is she didn't really have to lose anything in order to use her privilege. It didn't cost her much of anything in that example to use her privilege to make it easier or actually more equitable for her sister-in-law, right? So a few things. The sister-in-law said something about how she was second guessing how to respond. So many people of color go through that second guessing conversation on a daily basis. Can you imagine how much more energy we're having to spend emotionally and mentally in order to try to navigate this world that has discredited, rendered us invisible, and rendered us silent? That is a heavy burden. Truthfully, by the end of a day, oftentimes we're exhausted. But because her sister-in-law stepped in, she at least relieved some of that burden, right? Not only that, I love the fact that she stepped in to make a situation right. Are there some situations in your professional space or your personal space that you probably need to make right? You may need to even go to a coworker or a staff member and ask for a do-over, because you came to the situation initially with a few assumptions you should not have come with, right? And I love how when the sister-in-law stepped in and leveraged her privilege, everyone else that was on the sideline trying to figure out what to do began to then join in, right? It can encourage, it can motivate, it can inspire, and it can trigger the agency of others around. How does that then become applicable outside of your personal setting and perhaps into a larger community, local, statewide, and national setting? That happens through policy. How do we get involved in advocacy in Memphis, in Atlanta, in New York? Because now we want to look at situations with a lens that counters some of our initial judgments, racism even, sexist thoughts, assumptions. And now we're saying, you know what? I've got to start looking at this a different way. I've got to find a way to leverage my privilege, to give an entry point to someone who otherwise would not even get in the door. And so now we can begin to look at that through policy. I mentioned in the beginning, the wealth gap. What are some ways that we can go after that wealth gap in this divided America? One is to intentionally advocate for policies that provide opportunities for Black home ownership, Latino home ownership, in the particular areas in which you're located. Increase access to down payment assistance. Increase access to an affordable credit for Black home ownership. Find ways, talk to your state reps, talk to your US reps and get to your senators, begin to push, especially in this, we're going to enter into an even more drastic more drastically challenging times under COVID, right? Eviction rates, the issue of forbearance running out and people having to figure out what to do with their mortgages and how to afford them, how to pay for them. What are some ways that we can contribute to true relief and recovery from this pandemic with respect to housing and other policies that will begin to protect those who have otherwise been victimized, look at the situation with an equity lens, and find a way to bring our divided communities back together? Coretta Scott King said that if we are truly to change and save the soul of this country, we may well have to become its soul. In doing this racial equity work, we've got to embody it. We've got to realize that it's as much a matter of the heart as it is of the mind. I've had so many friends who said to me, who are not Black, after George Floyd, I knew we had a problem in this country. I just didn't realize it was this bad. It finally broke hearts in ways that it had not broken them before. And then I felt like we had some camaraderie, because now you understand how deeply this matters. It's not just a matter of a policy conversation. It can truly save lives. So my hope is that in this conversation and your own personal journey and exploration, you realize, yes, this conversation is about race, housing equity, but ultimately it is about our humanity, how we treat one another, how we see each other as neighbors, as friends, as members of the same community. I've said in many of my other conversations and discussions on this topic that I really believe we need to launch a neighboring movement throughout this country. In the Christian faith tradition, and you see analogies to it in other faith traditions, we are commanded to love our neighbor as ourselves. We've fallen short of that command. I hope that today with this conversation, perhaps your eyes have been opened, your heart has been opened in ways that it hadn't been, that you might consider what it looks like to truly neighbor across racial differences, to truly become neighbors and partners with those whom you've been leading, and realize that together we can truly create a united community and country to benefit us all. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions.
Natasha, thank you. That was amazing. I always learn something new, every time we do this. This time it was locked out and locked up. I hadn't heard that one. That's powerful. As well as the other kinds of privilege, the income privilege and education privilege. So you guys, don't forget that we're going to try to get some questions in. We may run over the hour. If you're available, we'll be here. So put them in the Q&A box. I'm going to kick us off. So Natasha, Habitat International, Memphis Habitat, and other Habitat affiliates across the country have been bold in affirming that Black Lives Matter, right? I know, though, that some people bristle at that language. And, some think that overall Habitat has become too political. And for me personally, I don't see advocacy or advocating for something I believe in to be particularly political, However, it seems that some would want to take the Black Lives Matter ideology and platform and turn it into something insidious. So what's your perspective on that as we work to speak up for one group and help them be heard and acknowledged without alienating another? What would you say to that?
That's a great question. Let's say first that there's the Black Lives Matter, what I call a desperation plea, and there's a Black Lives Matter organization. When we say Black Lives Matter, oftentimes I think it's important that we clarify, we're making a desperate plea that Black lives actually matter. We're not saying necessarily that we're endorsing the organization that also has the same name. I think that's an important distinction. Black Lives Matter, it's fascinating to me the way people react to that. The fact that we have to say that in and of itself is a shame. We have to say that because for so long, Black lives have not mattered. For so long, my children, myself, we have not mattered. And we can see that when we look at all the data about what really matters in this country. When we look at income data, wealth data, housing data, education data. I mean, for the most part, you look health statistics. People of African descent in this country have been at the bottom rung, and it has been set up that way. I mean, when you even look at the evolution of slavery into the penal system, into the criminal justice system and the levels that have been taken to make sure that people of color do not have access to the same things that are considered the American way. It is important. So one analogy is often talked about in this Black Lives Matter conversation. If you're in a neighborhood and the firemen are, and there's a house that's on fire and it's the black house, and the firemen are spraying the water on the black house, and someone comes along and says, don't all houses matter? The fireman says, yes, they all matter, but right now the black house is the only one on fire. We've got a fire that we have to put out in this country. To really be and live up to those ideals that all are created equal, not just men, women and men of all hues, it's important for us to begin to acknowledge that. You know, we just celebrated yesterday this 100th anniversary of the women's suffrage and women gaining the right to vote. What's sad about that, because we oftentimes haven't applied an equity lens even to history, is white women were given the right to vote 100 years ago, not Black women. Black women did not attain the right to vote until the 1965 Voting Rights Act. We have got to have a clearer sense of how this plays out in our country. Black Lives Matter is not saying Black lives are better than white lives or Black lives are better than blue lives. It is just saying they matter. So let's begin to consider them in the conversation about housing, education, health, about attaining the American dream in a real way.
That's powerful. And so, Natasha, along those same lines, you know, if we're gonna get to an understanding about race, we've got to be able to talk about it, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of people are saying that it's really difficult to talk about race, especially in the workplace. And I've had some conversations with some colleagues of mine, say a white CEO of a Habitat affiliate saying, how do I have this conversation with my team without, you know, looking like I'm favoring one side or alienating another? So, you know, it probably fits in that same forbidden category as religion and politics. Mm-hmm. But it seems like if we're going to get some understanding, we've got to talk about, you know, the pressing societal issues, and the matter of race has to be dealt with.
Right.
So, but it's uncomfortable.
Right.
And so what advice might you give, I would say in particular to white leaders trying to strike the right balance in educating their teams and, you know, being sensitive to all views?
Yeah, it's such a great question, because again, we say, oh my gosh, the forbidden issue of race. And what's so crazy about that is, whether you like it or not, the majority of people in this country are affected because of the conversation of race. You know, people say, do we have to talk about race again? This country was founded on differentiating the races. Yes, we have to talk about it again, because it's not just a conversation for the folks that have been on the bad side of the conversation of race. When you have privilege, again, race to you is not, it's just a conversation. That's how you know for you, you have privilege. That's another privilege check for you, right? But this conversation of race is essential to really creating an organization that is truly healthy in this country. You cannot get around it anymore. We do not live in a monolithic country. No matter how you slice it or dice it, this has nothing to do with partisan politics. It is the reality. The issue of housing is not a partisan issue. It's an American issue. It's a human issue when you get outside of the boundaries of this country, right? So this conversation on race, if you're a white leader, create a space that says, hey, look, I don't have all the answers. I'm probably going to say something wrong, right? That's the other thing. We're afraid in the conversation of race to just say something that's going to offend people. And I just ask you to give me grace, and I promise I will give grace to you, because we've got to figure it out. One quick analogy that I use in this space oftentimes is, this conversation on race is kind of like an old pantry in your kitchen, where you put everything in the corner that you never want to use. Those sardines you're never going to open, that nasty jelly somebody gave you, some onion jelly someone gave you as a Christmas gift or a birthday gift, you know, all the things you never use, some crackers, and take all those things out, put them on your table, and find a recipe together. That's what we've been given. We've been given this bag of goods of not so good stuff that we've got to now figure out how to make a recipe. And we hopefully can try to figure it out by not adding too much of the sardines to our mix, right? How do you create a recipe? We were all born into this. The realization that we're all born into this is important. The realization that The race conversation is not the conversation that only a person of color can have. We all need to own this mess and figure out together how to strategically implement systems that are more equitable. And the last thing I'll say on this, we often get in this race conversation and we're like so overwhelmed. Oh my gosh, it's so huge. When have many of these folks on this call are leaders, they're strategists. Use that same skill set to find a way to make more equitable systems in your organizations and in your communities.
Use that privilege.
That's right.
And first of all, I want to say I love sardines and onion jelly.
There we go.
But you know, I want to get back sort of to the race and housing issue. So in that recent conversation I had with Richard Rothstein, you know, who I have great respect and admiration for, he sort of started suggesting that, you know, Habitat and other affordable housing providers may be continuing the segregation of housing, you know, by placing our affordable housing initiatives in already impoverished communities. And, you know, I admit, and we all do, anyone else on this phone doing affordable housing, that it's hard and it has many challenges. In fact, many of the government and other funding programs that we can access give us more scores when we do our developments in these generally lower income communities and lower income census tracts. So on one side of the coin, it looks like these program dollars are driving reinvestment back into these communities. And then on the other side, it seems like we are, you know, forced clustering of low-income families in those same communities instead of providing, as Richard Rothstein was saying, sort of a greater choice to live in communities of opportunity. So, you know, what would you say to that?
I think it's a both and. As you know, and many folks on this call know, Richard has researched this topic, these issues at length. He's actually in the process of writing his second book, so stay tuned. There's a great article that he wrote, and it was published in the New York Sunday Times, so take a look at that. I continue to work with him in this space, and we have these conversations. And if we're honest about it, Dwayne, as you've acknowledged, and many of the folks in our network and other affordable housing providers, we typically do continue to develop housing in places, you know, that may lack resources. So there are different approaches. When I say both and, we've got to continue to develop in areas where we perhaps can usher in new resources, a place-based model that begins to build resources in existing communities of color. That's important. Turning and working with them to create communities of opportunity, right? How do we begin on the policy side in those communities to not just bring the housing, but to bring resources, to bring adequate educational opportunities for kids, to bring, you know, organic food grocery stores. We can't even get those on certain sides of Atlanta, for instance. And I know that's the case in other places. And there are resources there, but because of whatever the NIMBYism or not wanting to locate in places where people of color live, because of all that has been said to make that a negative situation, people have veered away from it. So you've got that piece, but you also do, the both and, need to push for inclusionary zoning and to really begin to provide opportunities for integration for those who desire it. Why should they be excluded from living in those places? So the forced clustering, you know, the more negative version of that is the ghettoization of affordable housing. We don't want to contribute to that. We do want to provide home ownership opportunities, but we now need to figure out how can we begin to find the necessary, whether it's a subsidy, whether it's donors, whether it's philanthropy, that begins to drive and provide for land acquisition in communities of opportunity, where oftentimes we can't even begin because we can't afford the land in those places, right? And to your point, on the policy side, there are policies that perhaps may be well-meaning, but they drive the continued development in low-income communities that have great need, but you can't just bring the housing. You've got to bring a comprehensive community of opportunity approach to those areas, working obviously with the residents of those areas to understand what they need, what will it take for them to flourish, how can they have their own agency in the development of those places. I think it's a both and in that conversation that we've got to
I agree with
push
you.
for.
I agree. So we're at the top of the hour. I want to just ask you if you could sort of sum this up and leave us all with a parting comment. You know, where do we go from here, Natasha?
Yeah. I think there are a few things. So my encouragement to those of you on the call was to make sure you're doing your personal excavation, because you're in places of leadership, you have spheres of influence. I truly urge you to do your personal excavation in this space. Where are your shortfalls? Where are your pain points? How can you go back and try to have some do-overs with people that you have, perhaps slipped up on, made judgments, assumptions about? So there's a personal component. On the professional space, in this housing space, I've mentioned a few things that we can do. Begin to support housing policies that allow for there to be the development of community of opportunities in places where they have oftentimes been bereft of resources. Begin looking for inclusionary zoning opportunities, looking for decreasing the required lot size so that we can perhaps put more homes in areas that could be affordable. Begin talking to your legislators. Vote, 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 and begin becoming a spokesperson and taking agency in this area so that we can begin to transform our cities and our communities.
So Natasha, we've got people still engaged and they have some burning questions. I want to try to get to a couple of those.
Awesome.
One of them is from our friend here in Memphis, Dorian Spears. And she's saying, how do you navigate maintaining sanity and prevent exhaustion in this work?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. The phrasing that I use for that, Dorian, is you've got to find your own soft place to land. So there's one, you're out on the battlefield, we're out here pushing this stuff, fighting, getting frustrated more times than not, probably. You've got to have a place where you can convene with folks who are really pushing for this and who give you a space to rest, who aren't constantly, in the fight. You've got to find a place where you fill your cup. So for me, I'm honestly, during this pandemic, it has been walks outside, being surrounded by nature. For you, it might be a good book. It might be a great, wonderful cup of tea. It might be fellowshipping with a friend. You've got to truly take that time off, because what'll happen is, I always say in this work, we're always pointing our finger. This is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. But there are three fingers pointing back at us. So these three fingers pointing back at us are reminding us, one, we're not perfect. We've got excavation to do, but we also have to find the space to rest, to refuel, so that we don't become bitter and disgusted and give up or peter out.
Awesome. Thank you very much. This has been enlightening. Every time we have this conversation, I continue to learn, and I'm hoping that our colleagues are too. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and say thank you to everyone for joining the call today. As I said, this is just the first Plus You conversation that Memphis Habitat plans to host. Our next date is not yet set, but the topic we hope to explore is around the intersection of housing and children's educational outcomes. We're currently looking at dates in mid-October. Also, we're planning a large-scale learning event called Health in Housing, and we think that's going to take place in January of 2021. And that'll be another virtual learning opportunity with some national experts. So stay tuned to our website and social media, or sign up to receive our emails to be the first to hear about our plans. If anybody wants to reach out specifically to me, my email is dspencer@memphishabitat.com. I'd love to hear your ideas as we continue to seek learning and gain understanding on all of these, primary and tertiary issues that impact affordable housing in our country. We know that this particular issue of racism didn't just spring up overnight. And we know that we can't stamp it out overnight, right? But I encourage all of us, as I think Natasha has as well, to be open to hearing and listening and learning and truly being present while doing so, which involves cultivating empathy. We often see the world through the lens of our own experiences and beliefs. But when we're empathetic, we understand the situation or issue from someone else's point of view. And that's important if we truly want to progress rather than regress. So I want to thank you all for joining us again, and have an awesome rest of the day. Take care, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.